Take a look behind the curtain with a real whistleblower and American patriot. Prepare to embrace the uncomfortable truth because this program has no time for comforting lies. Here is civil liberties enthusiast, Second Amendment defender, and recovering FBI agent Kyle Seraphin.
Hello, my friends. Welcome to the Kyle Seraphin Show. Today's Tuesday. It's June the 17th, and I appreciate you being here with us today. We're going to talk about Daddy Went to War last night, which is the narrative now being spun by the folks on the left. The mainstream media has decided that the guy in Minnesota was a Trump supporter. Case closed because a guy said it. Fat guy on camera said it. We played it for you yesterday. He likes InfoWars. He's not a fan of Jim Waltz or Jim Biden, whatever that means. And he likes InfoWars. So, yeah, that means that he's a big Trump supporter. And that's why he went on a shooting spree. Doesn't make a ton of sense. There's a lot of sort of smoky, weird narrative. We covered a little bit yesterday. We're going to do some more today as the affidavit has come out in the charging documents from the FBI. Some other FBI news out there indicating that the 2020 election was, in fact, targeted by the Chinese. A breaking story came out quite recently, either last night or earlier this morning, talking about the Chinese attempting to flood the 2020 election with mail-in ballots and fake IDs. You know, some things that people have been talking about election fraud in the 2020 election for quite a while, including FBI whistleblowers who may or may not have been the originators and starters of this podcast with me. So we're going to talk about those things. I'm also seeing some interesting moves that these political rallies are causing out there in some of the major cities. There's crying, of course, about ICE deportations, but there's also this instinct that maybe law enforcement officers shouldn't cover their faces. I'll tell you this, from being out there in the rallies that happened in Austin, the people who covered their faces were the hard leftists that were looking to commit crimes. And up until very recently, in fact, COVID is the only breakpoint that I'm aware of. It used to be illegal at the state and local level in almost every municipality. You could not cover your face in order to conceal your identity on the suspicion that you were attempting to get away with a crime. Maybe it's time that we go back to that. There's a lawmaker in California that is trying to push the case that federal agents shouldn't be able to cover their faces, and neither should local police. The funny thing is the supremacy clause outrules all of these things. So we're going to talk about a whole bunch of these things and some other stuff as well, you know, as we often do here. First, we're going to get started like it says on the wall in my house where we do our coffee. But first, coffee. It's a requirement. There can be nothing else. We must start that way. Let's talk about my friends over at Blackout Coffee. Found out last night that my Blackout Coffee, I've got 10 pounds inbound. That's how we do it here in the Seraphin household. Blackoutcoffee.com/KYLE. We have been telling you about Blackout Coffee for a couple of months. If you guys haven't tried it yet, you can do the same thing that I do. You can just order a huge bag of it, or two, because that's how we do it. I've got an additional 5-pound bags. I'm going to end up with at least 15 pounds of coffee in my house because that's a survival tool for us, especially when we have our 4 kids who wake us up at all hours. This is not just another coffee brand. They're a coffee that is built on hard work and grit and American values. In the same way that we built this podcast up from the ground up with an organic audience, they did the same, working out of a garage, building into a large warehouse facility that employs 30 hardworking Americans. They don't have any ICE raids coming their way. They're sending these things out of Florida. If you guys get the notice, you know what I'm talking about. You get that little notification. Your order has been picked up by the good folks that are going to ship it to you. It's just damn good coffee made by people who actually do care about the product. They're not just about a great cup of coffee. They're also about supporting the American dream and the American values that built it. These folks didn't do any shortcuts. There's no woke nonsense. There's no weak beans. Actually, all pretty strong beans. Whenever I drop beans, I actually go pick them up off the floor and I throw them back in the grinder because that's how stingy I am about not losing any of these things. You know, because I worked for all of it, just like these guys did. If you guys want to go and try it, I like the pitch black. That is the espresso dark roast. I like my coffee to be inky black, and then I like to go and throw a bunch of fat cream in there. We get it's far too expensive, but we get some whole cream that my wife picks up and I don't want to know what it costs. It's blackoutcoffee.com. If you guys want to save 20%, you use my name, blackoutcoffee.com/KYLE. Use the promo code Kyle. Make sure it is in there at checkout. It doesn't matter when you do it. You'll save 20% on your first order. As far as I can tell, you'll save 20% on any order whenever you go out there to do that. And if you do find one that you like, set up a subscription and have them send it to you every 6 weeks or however long it takes you to get through it. Keep the American dream alive. Drink some real coffee. Support a great company. Drink Blackout Coffee. Link in the show description. Let's get going right now. And you guys caught me having a little bit more of that coffee. Actually, before we got going live, my son, who is 4 years old, but thinks he's about to be 5 at any moment, even though his birthday is 9 months away, he was standing outside my door for something like 5 minutes, just sitting there holding on to my cup of coffee. And then he had to get my wife, and my wife brought him in. And that's one of the joys about doing this. There's a whole story that I found about fathers, and I don't even know if we're going to cover it, but apparently 96% of fathers think democratic ideals, like we should have universal health care and everybody should be able to pay for elderly support, a bunch of other nonsense that I looked out there. So I've actually got a story about health care that was really bothering me. Steve Friend and I were going back and forth this morning talking about the scam that is healthcare. And we'll see if we get into that as well. Let's go ahead and start off with some other scam stuff in the medical world. You know, one of the institutions that we've lost a lot of respect for. I used to think the CDC were kind of like heroes, maybe because I watched the movies Outbreak. I saw that Dustin Hoffman movie. I read the book as well. I thought that they were really cool. We saw all these examples in the 90s where the guys would come in with the Happer suits and they'd be doing full ISO containment, and they would, you know, go into the hot zone, which is just the zone where all the biological contagions were, and they saved us from that. And they were out there trying to find solutions, and hero doctors with cool face masks and all that. Injecting monkeys with stuff. Yeah, you guys know what I'm talking about? The CDC, there's an official who was overseeing the COVID hospitalization data, has resigned because RFK Jr.'s vaccine orders are making her have big, sad feelings. A Center for Disease Control official who led the agency's network to study hospitalization trends from infectious diseases like COVID-19 has resigned in protest, following HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s orders to change the agency's vaccine recommendations and to swap out the committee that makes said recommendations. This is Dr. Fiona Havers. Of course it is. Her last day was Monday, according to an announcement sent to the agency through the official chain and her official emails within the agency's Coronavirus and Other Respiratory Viruses Division. That seems like a very useful division. The Coronavirus and Other Respiratory Viruses Division. Yeah, they received notice shortly after Reuters reported it. So she leaked her resignation to the media first. She said, quote, "I no longer have confidence that these data, I know that's the right way to say it, that it's a plural term. It's both singular and plural, but I really hate the word data. The data, blah, 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 blah. All right. These data will be used objectively or evaluated with appropriate scientific rigor to make evidence-based vaccine policy decisions." She wrote in an email that she sent to colleagues slightly before the announcement. She was an infectious disease researcher who's worked with Havers. It said that she got the email voicing concerns with how the data would be used, describing the resignation as the latest in the dismantling of the agency's expertise. It's a big loss to the CDC, said this researcher who's not allowed to speak to CBS News, but spoke to CBS News on condition of anonymity. So we got a media leak, and we've got a lady that is appealing to the authority of the CDC, which discredited itself in whole cloth for the last 4 years. And we're supposed to feel sad about that. Like, of all the things that we voted for, that was it, right? We wanted J6's pardon. At least I did. I didn't want them to deal with this weaponized DOJ. We also saw the weaponization of these institutions that just said, you have to trust us. And by the way, your loved ones are going to have to die alone. That's what has to happen to them. Because we said so. We've cited fake documents, fake evidence that couldn't even be gathered at the time that it was, but we're worried that there will not be appropriate scientific rigor and evidence-based vaccine policy decisions, despite the fact that many thousands of military service members and thousands of federal employees and many tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of you lost your job when Joe Biden shoved this OSHA mandate down without any scientific rigor. There was none. I know there was none because everybody still got sick. I still got sick. The people that were in my office who had the COVID shots got sick. I went into my boss to tell him I was not going to get a COVID shot. And at that time, his wife, who had received the vaccine, was homesick with COVID. And he said, it's the stupidest thing ever. And then he still told me that I couldn't come into the office. I think the funny thing about this, the entire COVID debacle, if there's anything funny about so many people losing their jobs, a lot of lives being lost alone behind a pane of glass away from their loved ones. I think the funny thing is that we got to see who was who. We got to realize that the folks that said that they would give their life for freedom and to protect you wouldn't even give their paycheck up, not even for a short period of time. And even the people who I really respected, who generally agreed with me, there were hundreds of people inside the bureau when I was working there that had the same sentiment as me, like, absolutely not. All of them complied with a thing that they knew was also wrong, which was that they were supposed to get this unapproved nasal swab with ethylene oxide on it, which is a known carcinogen. And they're putting it into a mucosal membrane at a rate that never happened before. Do you know how many nasal swabs you get in your lifetime up until 2020? Maybe once a flu season, if you came into an emergency room. Maybe once if you came into to your doctor's office, they do a nasal swab and they get a flu test. So you get this little exposure in this very, very sensitive part of your body that has a direct access to a ton of little vasculature. Ethylene oxide, micro exposure. You get exposed to micro, carcinogens on a regular basis. This is a thing that happens, but you don't get massive doses, and you certainly don't get it every single couple days. How many people were swabbing for a drug, for a disease that was being over-suggested, was being over-tested for, as they pumped up all of the cycles on these tests? Like, how many people are going to end up with some sort of strange cancer simply from the tests? And will they ever be able to track it back? And the odds are, I don't think they will. But this lady had to resign because we are no longer objectively evaluating the appropriate amount of scientific rigor. No, everything about that just made me feel gross. Maybe as gross as this. We've got a couple of stories that are in the same sort of vein here. A federal judge has ruled that the Trump directives canceling NIH grants are void and illegal. And the reason is that some of these grants were canceled and they involved LGBTQ plus issues. That's what I think our federal government needs to be spending the most amount of time on. The smallest single percentage of people. And I don't know what sort of grants are needed to study lesbian issues or gay issues or bisexual issues. It almost always comes down to the T and the Q and the plus, whatever the hell those things are. And of course, the judge is in Massachusetts. Federal judge in Massachusetts, it's a district judge, of course, ruled on Monday that directives from the Trump administration that led to the cancellation of several research grants from the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, were void and they were illegal. The district judge's name is William Young. He said the cancellation of the grants related to studies involving LGBTQ plus issues, gender identity and diversity and equity and inclusion, all these things that we really know is what healthcare is all about, because we're not biologically all built the same. Whatever happened to the scientific rigor, the objective application of just data? By removing these grants, they violated federal law, saying that it was a case of racial discrimination and discriminations against LGBTQ plus communities, and ruled in favor of the plaintiffs in the case. 2 lawsuits have been filed against the administration, one led by the American Public Health Association, sounds like an enemy group, and the other filed by 16 states. Some estimates have suggested that up to $1.8 billion in research has been cut. The funding has been recut. This guy is Judge William Young, was a Ronald Reagan appointee, that he was ordering the NIH to restore the grants that were terminated. And so a judge who's been on the bench since the 80s is saying that you must pay out these dollars and that there is no discretion that the Trump administration would have. In a statement, Andrew Nixon, Director of Communications for the Department of Health and Human Services, said that the agency stands by its decision to end funding for the research, saying that it prioritized ideological agendas over, there's that word again, scientific rigor and meaningful outcomes to the American people. Under the leadership of Secretary Kennedy, the Trump administration, HHS, is committed to ensuring taxpayer dollars support programs rooted in evidence-based practices and the gold standards of science, not driven by divisive DEI mandates or gender ideology. That actually sounds objectively reasonable. Who are the people that are out there fighting for this other stuff? I feel like it's the same folks that have been pushing a narrative and an ideology that there is this victim population that's just waiting. They're just waiting to be properly seen. And if we could just see them enough and just support them harder and put more money into whatever it is that they want, that suddenly all the world would be just. This is the problem with the social justice movement and the idea that you'd put a modifier in front of the word justice, which requires no modifier whatsoever. I remember Ben Shapiro saying this years ago when I used to sit in a surveillance car and listen to Ben Shapiro podcasts, which I would listen to at 1.5x, which is very entertaining. Probably like listening to me sometimes. And he said, when you put a modifier in front of these words like justice, which are values that we should aspire to, then you immediately cheapen it. And so things like economic justice and environmental justice and social justice, they're all nonsense. They're cheapening. They're bastardizations of justice. You know, how about evidence-based practices? What works? Actual science, rigorous tests without any interest in the outcome. That may be the legacy of the last 5 years. That all these institutions that we used to just trust, how many people thought that they just needed to have health insurance? It was a thing that was required of them in their life. If you were a grown-up, you had health insurance. You had to have auto insurance, so you got to have health insurance. The price you pay for an Obamacare plan could surge next year because all of the monies that are being dumped in by the folks that are getting their wallet strained on behalf of others, they're now going to go away. These little subsidized healthcare plans through the Affordable Care Act marketplace. It made me start thinking about this because Steve Friend and I were talking about it this morning. The whole idea of health insurance, which, by the way, I haven't had since June of 2022. And we had a baby. And it turns out if you don't actually go to a doctor very frequently, and many of us don't anymore simply because of what happened in the last couple of years. Now, plenty of you people, you guys go and you have regular medical conditions. But if you're young enough, I highly encourage you to invest in the preventative care of being healthy before. I went into a doctor before I went to the FBI. It was I think it was a required fitness, physical, fit for duty physical. So I go in and I'm 35 years old and I'm running a couple miles every day. I used to joke that I was on a thing called the 6 mile diet, which is that you can eat anything you want as long as you run 6 miles every day. Steve Friend is on that diet. He runs 12 miles. He's running less right now because he broke a bone in his leg. It eventually happens to everybody. But yeah. If you're out there taking care of your health in a preventative way, if you're maintaining fitness, if you're eating relatively healthy foods and you're getting the things that you require, then what are you doing with the data that you go and get from a doctor? I have friends that are compulsive about getting their blood test results. I have no idea what my blood test results look like. I just wake up in the morning and I feel fine. I feel better now than I did when I was 25, when I wasn't eating well. I used to wake up and have all kinds of joint pains and stuff like that at 25. And I thought, damn, this is what getting older is about. Here I am 20 years later looking at it going like, no, I just was not in good shape. And then I made a lifetime of movement and I committed to doing things physically. And it turns out I can't tell you when the last time I've been to a doctor for anything meaningful, except at 35, I went into a fit for duty physical and I had them run my entire blood panel like they normally do. They sent it off to the FBI. And the lady said, your cholesterol levels are high. And I said, can you send me the test results? I'd like to look at it. By the way, she was on a phone. This was in 2016. She was on a phone in the same building that I was in. And the building was one story and it wasn't like a city block. It was like a regular little office building. And so the lady asked me, if I wanted to an appointment with a doctor. And I said, I don't know why I would want an appointment with a doctor. Why would I want an appointment? And she said, would you like an appointment so that we can get you set up with a statin prescription? I said, I'm 35. Why would I want a statin prescription? She was like, to handle your cholesterol. And I'm like, you're not even in the same room as me. You're just looking at a piece of paper with some numbers on it. Why on earth would I want a statin? And she said, well, we're just going to advise you to eat less red meat and cheese. What? I said, did you even read anything? Have you ever read any scientific literature? Like essentially what the literature that I'm reading, because I did read this kind of stuff and I do have friends that are interested in it. Cholesterol levels have less and less to do with what's going on in your diet. They say that it has anywhere between like maybe 10%, but 5% is more likely. And it depends on your genetics and a bunch of other factors. And why would you go out there and treat a single individual number? It's the one thing they teach you right away when you start entering into medicine. When I entered into emergency medicine, even as an EMT basic, they teach you, you do not treat a number. You don't look at somebody's heart rate and then start treating it. When I was that age, my heart rate, my resting heart rate was in the mid 40s. It's not a brag. That's just what was going on. I ran a lot. I had a very fit heart. My resting heart rate was in the 40s. If you went and held my hand, there were times in my life when I was in my late 20s, when I was working in the military, when my resting heart rate was in the high 30s. That's a beat almost every 2 seconds. It feels crazy when you don't know what that is. I'd sit still and they would wait for my pulse and think that it wasn't normal, you know, especially if you go into like general population medicine. And they'd be like, oh, you don't look around and go, oh my God, his heart rate is 38. We're going to have to put some paddles on him and start pacing him. No, you would look and you'd be like, the guy's alert. He's conscious. He's oriented. Everything is normal. He has a very low heart rate. I bet he has a high degree of fitness. That would be a normal thing. And instead, what we do is we all put this money in and think that we're going to go to a doctor who's going to tell us from some numbers how it is that we feel every day. The price could surge on that insurance plan that you're paying for. I'm just going to read some of the story because when I started reading it, it got me really more irritated about the idea that we think there's still a huge number of people that are dropping cash every single month for something that if they actually need something from their plan, they're going to have to keep dropping cash. Steve Friend said it's the equivalent of paying for a gas insurance, like a motor vehicle gasoline insurance plan, where $2,500 a month is deducted from your paycheck, but there's still a $10 copay every single time that you go to the pump. Or you could just pay $50 when you have to fill up, and you only have to do it 2 or 3 times a month. Wouldn't that be interesting? So instead of paying $2,500 plus your 3 copays, you're at $2,530. You're paying like $150. Listen, we had a baby in the house that we used to live in, and we didn't have insurance. And the out-of-pocket cost was less than $5,000. We even had an emergency show up. I had to pay $500 for an ambulance to show up with oxygen one time. And it was still $25,000 cheaper than it would have cost if we had done it in a hospital and we'd done it the way that people had done it for however many years before that. It turns out for thousands and thousands of years, people have been able to just survive without knowing every little detail about their heart that they don't do anything about. My favorite is this. How many of you go and get your blood test results and find out, oh, my sugar is high, my cholesterol is this, and then do nothing about it except try to take a pill? How many of you said, maybe it's time for a treadmill. Maybe it's time for me to start doing a swimming routine. I used to be fitter when I was doing gymnastics. I'm going to start stretching every day. Or do you just go and take a pill? Josefina Morales works part-time on an overnight shift as a receptionist at the Miami Beach condominium that during the day, she can care for her 3 kids, her aging mother and her brother who's paralyzed. So they just found the most difficult life situation there is, a woman that's taking care of children who sound like they're young, an aging mother, so now she has a live-in mom, and a brother who fell apart because he has epilepsy. Oh, how interesting. His epilepsy allowed him to become disabled when he contracted COVID-19 in 2020. She has to feed her mother, bathe her mother, give him medications, and do the same thing for her adult brother who fell apart in 2020. He lives with us because we feed him and we take care of his personal needs, she said. He doesn't say, I need this or that. He's forgotten everything. He's like a living vegetable. This is a truly difficult situation. And my heart goes out to this woman, Josefina Morales, 41 years old. Her husband works full-time, and she has to have a part-time income in order to qualify for Florida's Medicaid program, which means we're subsidizing the medical coverage there. But she makes slightly too much money to get the Medicaid program. So she is now using the subsidized health insurance through the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. And she's worried that next year that the coverage is going to cost too much because she pays for, she's paying for her prescription blood thinners. She has a cholesterol medication, and she's had 2 surgeries, including one to treat a genetic disorder. This woman really needs, she has a catastrophic medical situation, it sounds like. There used to be an idea that you would spend money on insurance to avoid the catastrophe that could happen. Like, I was in a car accident and my car was totaled, but also my body was hurt. And I unexpectedly now have broken things and require surgery to put a pin in my hip or to replace, something, put together one of my long bones that's not going to stay together. And we're going to put a piece of steel in there. We're going to put a piece of aluminum or titanium. Okay, fine. To have insurance every single month that you're paying out of, and most of you pay hundreds and hundreds of dollars out of every single paycheck, probably like this poor lady. And then what? Then you go and you pay more money when you go to a doctor. I remember making co-pays to my doctor at the, and they were for quote unquote wellness visits. We would go to visits all the time, pediatricians when we had little kids, and that's just what you did. And the legacy is like, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm not interested. This is going to take us to our next story, which is about medical coverage not even being beneficial to people. I'll just give you a tease of it. Abortion providers are devastated by the political hit list and the killings of the two people that were in Minnesota. That's going to be kind of the main story I want to get into because it's so crazy. But just, I want you to know that this story was written by The Guardian, an overseas newspaper. And the lead of their story is that the people who are most upset about what happened in Minnesota are abortion providers, which of course they consider to be healthcare, people who make a living killing and dismantling babies. I cannot fathom the idea that I would spend money on a maintenance plan for my vehicle, and then every time that I needed maintenance, I would also pay additional money. This reminds me of a story that I read the other day of a guy who, this was a video that he was on the phone with an ambulance provider, and he got a bill for like $1,100. And he was like, hey, they go, do you have insurance? And he was like, yeah, I have insurance. And so he sent them the insurance information, and they were like, oh, you no longer qualify for the uninsured individual pay discount. The bill went from being $1,100 with no insurance, where you were just going to pay out of pocket, to $1,500 because your insurance only pays a certain amount. And the full billing amount is like $3,500. Your insurance covers $2,000 and we need another $1,500 or whatever it was, or like the numbers were insane. It was more expensive because he paid for insurance. And he said, can I cancel my insurance? And they said, no, you already had coverage on that day. If you took the money, I would bet this for most of you, if you took the money that you had paid into insurance on a monthly basis, I'm not making financial advice, I'm just speculating here because this is what self-insurance would look like. You'd take that money, you'd put it into an escrow account for yourself, and then you probably would be able to cover all of your medical bills and pay them at the discounted rate, which exists for people that don't have insurance, the cash pay amount. There's a reason why health insurance companies make a fortune and have like hundreds and thousands of employees doing bureaucratic processing. What are those people doing? They're taking your money, they're putting it in their pocket, they're putting it in their boss's pocket, who runs the company, right? Or the company's shareholders get it. And then somehow you're getting the best deal on health insurance and health care? The numbers don't add up. And I think a lot of us are asking these questions these days. In any case, let's talk about something you can control. Things inside of your own house, handling emergencies that might come your way. I just ordered one yesterday. I don't know if I'm excited or worried because I know it's going to be kind of a responsibility. If you guys want to check out the Grid Doctor 3300 solar generator, maybe you also want to take a little bit of control and possession of your own situation. And you can do so at mypatriotsupply.com/Kyle. You're going to see that they have a deal running right now on the Grid Doctor 3300 solar generator, and they're going to give you two additional waterproof 200-watt solar panels completely free. Those things are a couple $100 a piece. I just got two coming in and the Grid Doctor. Folks, if you notice, during the summer, for some reason, that's when the power seems to go out, whether it's a heat wave or a summer storm, too many people running AC in your neighborhood because you live in Texas, or maybe you live in California and they just shut it off because they just don't want you to be comfortable. The fragile grid oftentimes cannot keep up because we run a podcast here and there are things that we need to have running. You probably have them as well. Refrigerator, freezer, lights, medical devices, whatever it may be. Or maybe you run a podcast and you want to have all your lighting and your computer stuff work. If you want to be able to be in control of your own electrical power, this thing has 3,300 watts of off-grid electrical power. It can keep all those types of devices running and more, and you can expand it outward. There are the options of adding multiple different layers of capabilities to it. Right now, they got a deal going on when you buy the 3,300 Grid Doctor. They're going to throw in two waterproof 200-watt solar panels and a cable to go ahead and connect them. These aren't cheap panels. They're durable. They're waterproof. They're built to last through storms and heat and God knows what else. They'll operate up to 104 degrees. You can put them in places and gather electricity and be off the grid. MyPatriotSupply.com/Kyle. MyPatriotSupply.com/KYLE. Get your free panels today with a buy of the Grid Doctor 3300. And yes, it is expensive. And yes, it is an investment. I think that their dollar amount is at least as good as anybody else's out there because I've been looking at them. There's some other companies that do the same thing. Check them out. They sponsor us. We appreciate them. Like I said, I just ordered one up. I'm going to put it in the corner. You guys will be able to see it pretty soon, powering the show just in case. MyPatriotSupply.com/KYLE. We'll keep going and let's start to the rage fest right here about the abortion providers that are most hurt and very, very upset about what's going on. You know, it's very troubling that this is where we're at. We have to worry about abortion providers' feelings because they were worried about a hit list. Abortion providers and reproductive rights advocates are devastated by the assassination of a Minnesota state lawmaker and her husband over the weekend by a suspect who allegedly planned to also target abortion providers. Former state speaker Melissa Hortman and her husband were shot and killed in their home. Everything about the story is crazy. The Minnesota State Senator John Hoffman and his wife were wounded in a shooting by the same suspect. And then, of course, as you guys probably saw in the, in the title of today's podcast, this nightmarish guy supposedly is adjudicated already to be a Trump supporter. Of course he is, because they decided it. They just said it. MSNBC and NBC have reported so. Therefore, we can't ask any more questions. The acting United States attorney for the District of Minnesota, his name is Joe Thompson. He said Monday that they found a notebook with the suspects writing in it. I've seen some pictures of this. You guys may have seen them on social media as well. The list of names of other potential targets, including abortion rights advocates, Planned Parenthood centers, an OBGYN named Jamila Pritt, or Prerit. Parrot? You guys know names are my nemesis. It's absolutely heartbreaking to know that in addition to those that were killed and injured, our community members of abortion providers were among those also planned to be attacked. So she wasn't a victim, and none of them were. But their names were in a list, and so therefore they could have been victims, and they feel victimized because of the possibility that they would have been victimized, even though they were not, in fact, victimized. We do have actually a statement of the FBI's update, and this is Joe Thompson. This is, again, the acting United States attorney talking about this story. We're going to get deeper into this, but I just thought it was interesting to note that the chief program officer for the National Abortion Federation said the harassment and violence targeting physicians, nurses, clinic staff, and other people they care for is yet another form of hate and fear-mongering inflicted by white supremacists and far-right extremists. We're definitely not going to just go out there and say something that doesn't exist. This is why we saw a Justice Department under Joe Biden that was weaponized against pro-life people. Who else were pro-life? Mostly the people that said they were not going to get a COVID shot turned out to have a pro-life sentiment. And apparently you're the enemy of all these people. So they're howling loudest right now because they don't have control of the government. God forbid they can't do the things that they were going to do. This is Joe Thompson giving the update on the story of this guy. We're going to do more on that. There's a great story at The Blaze. I'm going to read a bunch of it because nightmare is not even the beginning of how do you explain this stuff. It's just, it's incomprehensible what the backstory is and why you would immediately align with the idea that he was going to go after these folks. It sounds like this guy was totally nuts. Also got some real questions because the pictures that I'm seeing of the man wearing the mask, it doesn't seem to be in the same physique as the man that they've claimed was the guy wearing the mask. And all of that is very strange. Now, it may be so, and maybe it's just a camera angle trick, but the number of failings in law enforcement in Minnesota and the weird scenarios of people walking up and allowing him to go away and getting into gunfights, but then still being able to get into houses and then be able to shoot up and kill people. All of this stuff is pretty freaking wild. So let's just start with this press conference. This was yesterday at 11 a.m. Central.
Belter approached Representative Hortman's home, again dressed as a police officer, wearing the tactical vest and body armor, and wearing that hyper-realistic mask. He was armed and carrying a flashlight. Before he entered the home, 2 Brooklyn Park police officers arrived at the scene. They too had been dispatched to check on Representative Hortman after learning of the shooting of Senator Hoffman. When they arrived at the scene, they saw Belter's black SUV parked in the driveway with the emergency lights flashing, and they saw Belter standing in front of the house several feet from the door. When Belter saw the officers get out of the car, he drew his weapon and began firing. He rushed into the house through the front door, firing into it. He repeatedly fired into the house, and when he entered, he murdered Representative Hortman and her husband, Mark. The Brooklyn Park police officers fired at Belter as he rushed into the home, but he escaped into the home and out the back. Officers recovered Belter's 9mm Beretta, along with the body armor and the mask, behind the home along his path of flight when he fled on foot. They later searched Belter's car, where they found 5 more firearms, including assault-style rifles and a large quantity of ammunition. Belter also had in his car notebooks containing a list of more than 45 Minnesota state and federal elected officials, including Representative Hortman.
All right, so that's the thing. It goes on for a couple more minutes in this particular clip. That doesn't do justice to how ridiculously weird this story is. You're seeing on the screen, obviously, the quote-unquote hyper-realistic mask, which doesn't look particularly hyper-realistic to me. You can buy these on Amazon for less than $200. There are such things as hyper-realistic masks. I don't think this fits into that category, although they are trying to drum that up. This is a CBS story. And I'm going to also play you something from Fox, which happened before they brought him into custody, just to show you the weakness of the coverage that the mainstream media was doing on this story, and then why they're worried about, God forbid, conspiratorial views that are being passed around on social media, which was far more accurate and far more in the moment, especially for people that were in the flight plan and that were in the lockdown areas. You were getting hyper accurate information at a much higher rate. They went out there and quoted a couple of people who had far less information and far less views than my personal account did. And I found that to be kind of interesting. They kind of cherry picked their story. This is coming from CBS. It says Vance Bolter has been charged with the shooting of 2 Minnesota lawmakers and their spouses. The FBI said he visited the homes of multiple other elected officials the night that he killed Minnesota Representative Melissa Hortman and her husband, and then wounded State Senator John Hoffman and his wife. Bolter, 57, is charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder, 2 counts of second-degree attempted murder, according to the criminal complaint. He's also facing 6 charges in federal court, including stalking and murder. The FBI held a conference on Monday, which we showed you a little bit of. He appeared in federal court on Monday afternoon wearing an orange jumpsuit. He was being escorted by police officers. He was taken into custody on Sunday night near his Sibley County home following a manhunt that lasted for over 36 hours, and then he was caught near his home. The story and the details of the story get weirder and weirder, especially when you just take a sort of a short little look into it. But the man that you see on the screen right here does not appear to be the same man, at least not to my eye, as the kind of heavyset guy that we see in the picture when he was arrested. They showed pictures of him walking around wearing a cowboy hat. He has a very prominent and distinct heavyset, fat belly, if you will. He probably needs a statin. He doesn't look like he runs as much as 2016 Kyle. All of this is craziness. And of course, rather than go after what the actual story is, they decided the NBC News guys are going to go after the Minnesota shooting conspiracy theories, which took over social media. Again, I was getting real-time updates from law enforcement officers in Minnesota as early as maybe noon or 1 o'clock Central Time on Saturday. And they're claiming, and even the Blaze claims, that they exclusively got the name of the actual subject and who he was sometime on Sunday before he was captured, like Sunday morning. But for those of us that were paying attention, it was pretty clear what was going on. The names were being leaked out there really early on. And as I went on a program with Mike Church yesterday, we were talking about it. This guy has overseas connections that are completely illogical from the type of work that he was doing in the United States. He was supposedly doing some sort of passion-based Christian evangelism that made almost no sense to anybody. But he was doing it in the Democratic Republic of Congo because that's naturally where you would go. If you're from Minnesota and you're a white guy like this, you would just go to the Congo and set up a security company and a food company. And you totally were not involved with what we talked about the other day, the CIA's National Resource Group, which goes out and recruits people that do that kind of travel so that they could do the things that they need to do, like have influence in foreign areas. I want to play you Fox News coverage of this before we get into the conspiracies. The reason why people turn to social media is because on Fox News or MSNBC or NBC or any of the other major, like, you know, full-time outlets that are doing news, you get crap commentary from people that are basically the lowest IQ capabilities, giving non-real and no source whatsoever information. They went and they tapped a guy who's from like Washington, D.C., and knows nothing and has no contacts, as far as I can tell, in Minnesota. That's why people turn around and end up going to social media to get the closer to the real scoop. And you should be a skeptic. You have no idea who's on the other side of these anonymous accounts that are reporting like breaking news nonstop. There was one that was just outed this morning. Supposedly, I think it's called Red Pilled Media or something to that effect. It's like it's a freaking Pakistani guy, and they claim to be covering news for America. This is how bad it was on Fox News. I'm just going to give you this sort of like just for a couple seconds until I get irritated listening to it.
And President Trump is promising persecution to the fullest extent of the law. The FBI was offering a $50,000 reward for information leading to Bolter's arrest. Joining us now on the phone is former D.C. police detective and defense attorney, as well as a Fox News contributor, Ted Williams. Ted, we're just getting this information in the last 5 minutes or so. I want your take on what we're learning.
Well, what so far from what we know here, and this is all fluid at this time, but that there was a location where they found the automobile and they found what they believe was Bolter's cowboy hat, the cowboy hat that's in many of the pictures that he was seen wearing. And as a result of that, law enforcement made a concentration on that part of Minnesota. And it is my understanding, and from what we've been told, there have here been an arrest. I'm somewhat surprised because I thought that with all that we know about Bolter, and we know quite a bit now about him, that he very much was going to resist and probably go out with suicide by cop.
But he was going to do this thing, but then he didn't do the thing that he was going to do. This is coming from Ted Williams, who was a homicide detective in D.C. This is a very fluid situation. We're making it up. I'm just ascribing to the idea that he might have tried to kill himself by cop, but then he didn't. So we know that he didn't do the thing that I think that he might have done, even though I have no information about this man. DC's homicide clearance rate is about 62% is what I was able to find. That means that almost half the people who murder somebody in Washington, D.C. are not caught. And that's what this guy used to do for a living. It's not the worst homicide clearance rate that I've ever seen, but it's not very impressive. And I'm not sure why you would go to somebody from Washington, D.C., except these people go out there as mediocre commentators. People like FBI Barbie did the same thing. FBI Barbie, who I'm almost confident has never worked a single death investigation in her life because it's not something the FBI does, who was a coordinator for crimes on the high seas. All coordinator positions inside the FBI are people who don't want to do work or are not able to do work, and they just shove them into some place where they don't have to deal with them anymore. So she was that. Interestingly enough, there's another guy that's been hounding some of the other suspendables and bothering the living hell out of them on social media. Of course, it's social media. We're going to go there in a second and talk about that. But bothering these folks and saying a bunch of nonsense. And he touts himself as a frequent radio host or frequent radio guest. My favorite is that he was a DEI coordinator, which is another job that is like, if you can't do work, you go do the Federal Bureau of Things. In any case, You've got this NBC article that is very upset about social media conspiracy theories, which took over social media feeds. And it's been fed in that there's all this false information, and they're going to tell you what the real information is. I'm going to read it to you. This is the meat and potatoes of what the NBC News would like you to know. Melissa Hortman, who was killed, was a member of the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, as is Senator Hoffman, who was also shot. Bolter's car had notebooks with the names of more than 45 state and federal elected officials, so saith U.S. Attorney Joe Thompson on Monday. The federal criminal complaint against him says the officials named in the notebook were mostly or all Democrats, and several Democrats on Monday said they had been notified that their names were, in fact, in that notebook. Here's the strongest part. Bolter was a strong supporter of Trump and voted for Trump. His roommate, David Carlson, told NBC affiliate KARE of Minneapolis. So that's it. He's a Trump supporter, right? He must be. There's no other way around it. How could he be something else? Well, maybe there's more to this story, and I'm going to read you the stuff from The Blaze. This was written by Joe Hanneman, who works very well and frequently with our buddy Steve Baker. After 2 allegedly killed and attempting to kill 2 more, Bolter texted his family, "Daddy went to war last night," direct quote. The United States Department of Justice has charged Vance Luther Bolter with murder and the stalking and the assassination of top Minnesota lawmaker Monday, and revealed that he went on to 4 state legislators' house intending to kill them as well. This story gets weirder and weirder. He was charged in district court in St. Paul for 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of stalking, 2 firearms offenses related to stalking. He's being held without bond. He's also charged locally with first-degree murder and attempted murder, but the charges will be prosecuted on the federal level first. The story is really crazy. The story laid out in the criminal complaint and the accompanying FBI affidavits is unprecedented in Minnesota history. It's literally the stuff of nightmares, so says Joe Hanneman. He surveilled the homes of the victims. He researched their lives using commercial data sites. We always tell you guys to get your name out of these commercial data sites. I can attest to it. When sitting out on surveillance, it is very effective what you can find out on what we call open source. It's available everywhere. They used sites such as Been Verified, White Pages, Intellius, and numerous others. The affidavit said he carried out his rampage disguised as a police officer wearing what the FBI called a hyper-realistic silicon mask. So there you get that word. That's where it came from. He had a police uniform and a black tactical vest with body armor. The complaint continued. He drove a Ford SUV, detailed to look like a squad car, including emergency lights. But this is where it gets really weird. Just after 2 a.m. on June the 14th, he drove to the Hoffman home in Champlain. He knocked on the front door and apparently shouted, "This is the police, open the door." And we know this because these folks survived. The state senator, opened the door, and Bolter told them that there'd been a reported shooting at their address, asked them if they had any guns, and Senator Hoffman responded that there were, but all the firearms were locked away. Although Bolter was shining a flashlight in their faces, Mrs. Hoffman realized that he was wearing a mask. And then they realized he was not a real police officer, in which case he then responded, "This is a robbery." I'm just shaking my head here. Senator Hoffman tried to push him back out the front door, but was shot repeatedly. And then Mrs. Hoffman tried to shut the door on the suspect, but she was also shot repeatedly. The Hoffman's daughter called 911 at 2:06 a.m. to report that her parents had been shot. Good on this kid. Teach your kids how to respond to it, especially in an era. It made me start thinking, many of us do not have landlines anymore. And that thing is, it's kind of scary because when you were a kid growing up, you could just grab the phone and it was always on the wall. You knew where to do it. Now it's like you have to unlock somebody's cell phone and deal with 911. So if you're not training your young kids, it's probably a good wake-up call on how to do that. He allegedly then left the home, drove to the home of another legislator, referred to as public official number 1, over in Maple Grove. He repeatedly rang the doorbell at 2:24 a.m., shouting, "This is the police, open the door. This is the police, we have a warrant." The lawmaker was not home. Interesting. Why are you not home at 2:24 a.m.? So the suspect left the area, then drove to another home of another lawmaker in a place called New Hope, parked down the street. The New Hope police officer, this is the part that's so crazy to me. A New Hope police officer saw Bolter's vehicle, believed it was in fact a law enforcement officer providing protection for public official number 2. Why was there a rollout to do any of this stuff? Why, in fact, would you have law enforcement realize that because one state official was shot and in an alleged robbery, that other people would in fact jump out and all the local law enforcement would then start doing protective details? And why would they know where all these addresses are? That doesn't make a lot of sense to me, and why they would think this. Maybe they're all just well known in their area, but I don't know how small these areas, but the idea that you would just have a law enforcement officer providing protection and you're in that town and you don't know this vehicle and you don't know who this officer is. Apparently the officer tried to speak to Bolter through the vehicle window, but he stared straight ahead and didn't respond. So the officer continued driving. So you come upon a police car. There's a guy in it who looks crazy with that mask on. You try to talk to him and he doesn't respond. He looks dead ahead. And then you're like, whatever, I'm just going to keep doing my thing. The New Hope officer arrived at the home of the lawmaker and waited for backup, and at that time, the suspect left the area. So then about an hour later at 3:30, the police in Brooklyn Park sent squad cars to check on Melissa Hortman and her husband. Again, There's no obvious pattern here. Like, was there a distress call that went out? Was there some sort of statewide coordination saying, hey, it looks like lawmakers are being targeted because one was shot? That doesn't make a ton of sense to me that this would go on. Again, there's some background information that's missing. Maybe it does. Maybe there was that communication. The officers then saw a black Ford SUV parked outside of the home with its emergency lights flashing. This is apparently in the driveway or outside the home of Melissa Hortman. The license plate had been replaced with a fake plate that just had the word police printed on it. I almost want to throw that on the screen here, but some of you won't see it. Let me just say, it's just printed in small letters, not even the size of like a license plate ID. Very weird. They spotted Bolter on the porch, and he opened fire at them, as was described by the United States attorney. Then he moved into the house. Apparently, he had already gotten the door open, or maybe he kicked the door down. Not clear. There was a second set of gunshots being heard, which means that he killed Ms. Hortman, or Representative Hortman, and her husband, Mark, and apparently the family dog. They both died from their wounds. Then he fled from the house. And so the police officers didn't go in to this shooting. They didn't run in knowing that they saw the guy on the porch. They saw the vehicle that he came out of, and they didn't go inward, which is strange. Usually that's kind of like direct to threat, active shooter situation. He fled the home, left the SUV out front, which had all of his plans in it. And conveniently, by the way, the writing on this looks like women's handwriting to me. You look at the handwriting in these notebooks, and it is very, very clean. It is not like a man. It's not like a man. Let's just call it that. I've written lots of notes in cars. I have written lots of surveillance notes. They're always uncomfortable, even if you have like a nice writing surface. They are not perfectly laid out with evenly spaced letters. They're always some sort of scrawl or some sort of like coffee stain or something. This is a perfectly laid out notebook, which may be legit. Maybe he's a very fastidious writer, or maybe he's not, because all of that is really strange. In any case, the guy went out the back door of the house after shooting the family dog, abandoned the flashlight, took off the body armor, ditched the silicone mask, and the cops were unable to keep up with him as he's shedding equipment. If you've ever tried to take off body armor, it's pretty hard to do it on the run. It's something you usually would probably have to stop and do. The mask, what is he? He's running through the darkness with a mask over his face. Does it, he peels this thing off and then throws the flashlight. They found that stuff, so they got some really good pictures of the quote-unquote hyper-realistic silicone mask that covered his entire head. And of course, it does have kind of a skinhead appearance, right? It's a completely bald, older man-looking thing. So now you have far-right and white supremacists being alleged by the abortion providers. The police began tracking the cell phones known to be used by Bolter and his wife. She was in a vehicle in another place in Minnesota. I don't know what this one is, Anamia. She allowed the police to search her phone, and apparently her husband sent out a group text message at 6:18 in the morning, which said, quote, "Daddy went to war last night. I don't want to say more because I don't want to implicate anybody." He said, "Words are not going to explain how sorry I am for the situation. There's going to be some people coming to the house armed and trigger happy, and I don't want you guys around." So then the police searched the guy's wife's car, Mrs. Bolter's car. They found 2 handguns, about $10,000 in cash, passports for her and the couple's children who were in the vehicle when they were stopped by the police. Again, sometime at like 6-ish a.m. She had $10,000 in cash and passports and handguns in her car. What on earth is that? Like, having $10,000 in cash is probably pretty rare in America at this point. We've actually told you how hard it would be for like 50% of Americans to go out there and even pull up like $1,000. But let's say they have $10,000. That's not crazy. How did she get it at that hour? Almost always, to go and get that kind of money out of your ATM, you're going to be doing multiple ATM pulls. If you guys have ever had to pull cash out to buy, like, I don't know, a vehicle or a boat or an RV or a motorcycle or any of this kind of stuff, like, you have to actually think that out in advance. If you want 10 grand, you usually have to go into a bank and ask them in advance, because they won't give you 10 grand if you go in there and try to take a withdrawal slip with you. So all of that is strange. That sounds planned as well, but it also doesn't make any sense. Like, it's just, what mom would just be like, oh, I just need to grab my handguns, all this cash and passports, and I'm going to go drive around at 6 a.m. I've already got all my kids in the car. Daddy went to war last night. He's seen on security cam footage at home on Fremont in northern Minneapolis. The man who lived there told reporters that he rented a room there, like all dads do. They just rent a room with their friend. The guy who lived there says that he's known Bolter since grade school. He's the fat, out of breath guy that we showed you yesterday, who also he had a Papa John shirt on. Like, none of this makes any bit of sense. The best part is the crazy thing at the end. So the security camera footage shows that a man was walking around the SUV, bashed in the window with a blunt object, got in there, didn't apparently steal the vehicle, and then approached a man at 7 a.m. on 48th Avenue North and North Lindell Avenue in northern or North Minneapolis. The guy claims that Belter approached him and wanted to buy an electric bicycle from him. I'm just reading the story here. Then the two men got on a bus and went to that man's house. Do you want to know why we have social media conspiracy theories? Because the story in the affidavit is insane. He approached a random guy at 7 a.m. and said, "Hey, man, I'd like to buy an electric bicycle from you." And the guy was like, "Oh, yeah, I could do that. I could sell you an electric bicycle." Then they went to the man's house, and the guy said, "Can I buy your Buick?" And the dude was like, "For sure." Then they drove to a U.S. bank branch in Robbinsdale, Minnesota, where he apparently withdrew $2,200, which was the entire amount of the in the account. The security camera footage shows the man wearing a dark jacket and the cowboy hat. So we saw that picture on the news. And then he gave the witness $900 and took the e-bike and the vehicle. I don't know any cars that you could buy that will drive for $900 anymore, particularly not the Buick that I saw that was in the pictures. At 2:30, the police received a tip that somebody was riding an e-bike 2 miles north of the Belter's family home because he went home. That's what you would do. You would just go, "Hey, I've shot people. I've been driving around all night shooting at people. I just did an escape plan. My wife is running around with 10 grand in cash, and I told her that I went to war and she needs to get away from the house. So I'm going to go back to the house on an e-bike and a Buick that I bought from a guy for $900 on the street." The police then discovered the Buick that Bolter reportedly purchased earlier in the day, and it was abandoned on Highway 25, not far from the e-bike sighting. The officers discovered the cowboy hat and the letter addressed to the FBI. In the letter, he admitted that he was the shooter at large in Minneapolis, and that he was involved in 2 shootings earlier on the morning of Saturday, June the 15th. But I guess he actually meant it was what? Yeah, Saturday. I don't know. I think the 15th was the Sunday. They said sick here, so obviously something was wrong in that. Then they located him in a field at 9:10, and they arrested him. And that's the picture that you see on the screen right now. When they searched the 2015 SUV, the Ford SUV, they found license plates for the vehicle that he had taken off. They were registered in his name and his wife's name. They found 5 firearms, including semi-automatic rifles, a large quantity of organized loaded magazines, and apparently when they actually ended up finding that Beretta, which you heard about inside the in the news conference, he had field stripped it as he was running, and he took apart his Beretta and threw pieces of it in different places. But he's obviously a Trump supporter, because NBC News said so. You guys see how nutty everything about the story is? And they're quick to jump and say that case closed. He wanted to kill abortion providers. Remember? There it is. They're devastated. They're devastated by this guy. How about there's a million unanswered questions, and I would love to know what the actual story is, and we're probably not going to get it right now, but everything about this has that same feel that we got when the guy was outside of Trump's golf course. That you're like, wait a minute, he lives in Hawaii, but he also does recruiting in Ukraine, and he has like this rifle, but he like duct tape he's a felon, so he can't own guns, but he duct taped a scope to the end of like a weird AK, and then he was going to take a 300-yard shot on a golf course, and he sat there with a bag full of tiles and a backpack because he thought it would stop bullets. Like all the weird crap that we saw from that story, which by the way, I see no news coverage of it anymore. It's not like I look at the news every single day. Very, very little about Ryan Routh. Very little about this too. Almost all of this stuff is just questions. They said that they found various other notebooks. They went and searched his house. He had notes and personal details and addresses on these lawmakers, including who they were, if they were married, how many terms they'd been in office, that they had which ways they could go and you could do an approach on the house, like a target package is what you would get. We would sometimes create target packages for SWAT teams. We would go out there and we'd be like, okay, there's surveillance cameras in the back. There's an approach route through the alley. There's a squirt out area where somebody could sneak out of a back door or a window that's in this thing. There's a, and there's an egress point that is coming out of a basement and it's on the east side of the house, blah, blah, blah. You create a target package when you do surveillance. The thing you want to know is all the stuff. And apparently he's writing all this stuff down. Now, is it hard to figure out how to do a target package? Not really. Is it weird that it's all perfectly laid out in very, very clean handwriting that you can read with a photograph? I would say yes. If you read my surveillance notes, you would not be able to understand most of them until I translated them. That's why we typed them up after the fact. We almost always transcribed them after the fact because they were basically illegible. We'd have one person who had good handwriting to put together a surveillance log. And apparently, and I've worked with probably 24 male FBI agents doing surveillance, and most of them have garbage handwriting. But this guy just had perfect handwriting. I don't know why that bothers me so much, but that is like one of those weird details that sticks out with me. Okay. And so in the era of that, you just start looking at all the rest of the media coverage that's going on in the world, and you're just thinking, like, how much garbage are we being lied to? Donald Trump is apparently directing ICE raids on Democratic-run cities. I'm seeing that as well. So here's a story. This is like the other little piece of it, which is about masks. So I guess it's not perfectly related to today's news story. I sat on that because it's so weird. And if you haven't heard that story out loud, you probably won't take the time to read it. If you're like me, you're not going to read it. So I did it for you. This is CBS News. Donald Trump is directing immigration authorities to prioritize deportation in Democrat-run cities because he's really mean. In the same way that we know that guy was a really mean bad guy who hated abortion providers and was a Donald Trump InfoWars supporter. Trump said on Sunday night, that he directed federal immigration officials to prioritize deportation in Democrat-run cities. Why would that be, you think? Do you think it's because there already is plenty of cooperation in Republican-led cities? And by the way, how many Republican-led cities are there in the United States? How many major cities in this country are full of red leadership? Big cities. It's very, very few. How do you know, Kyle? Because I used to travel around and we would go and do those. We would go to all of these places and they're almost all, every single major place that I would fly into an airport is being run by some sort of leftist routine. It doesn't matter whether it's Philly or Pittsburgh, whether it's Washington, D.C., whether it's L.A. or Portland or Seattle. You go up there and you find out. It's like the people that don't want to cooperate with the feds to do immigration work, they're all on the left. So yeah, this doesn't make that much of a crazy statement, but they're acting like this is some sort of one-sided, enforcement action that is specifically targeting a political group, which is in fact sort of the overall push here. It continues to act like this guy is unhinged when he's just saying, we want to do a couple hundred deportations a day, less than Obama. Is that reasonable? Can we do that? There's another story that I saw. This is coming from The Guardian. Did I have two from The Guardian? No, one was from The Hill. This is from The Guardian. ICE agents detained a U.S. citizen as part of a Los Angeles immigration raid. And that's how you know that it's racial profiling. It's very, very bad and evil. Remember, white supremacist was the narrative yesterday. We heard it already. They were talking about that at the No Kings rally. No evidence of it, just feelings. And same story. It's racial profiling to go after Democrat-led cities and to detain a U.S. citizen while doing immigration raids. Do you guys know how detentions work? If there's a federal law enforcement action, if there's any law enforcement action and you're on scene, you get detained. That's what happens. We all sort of agree that that's how you do law enforcement. We used to do search warrants at MS-13 houses, and we would detain like a dozen random women that would be in there because there'd be a dozen families and a bunch of kids. You'd take them all out. You'd search them all. You'd put them all in the back of the Bearcat because it's freezing cold outside because that's when we did them, and it's dark. You'd sit them in the Bearcat, and you would have somebody keep an eye on them while you brought all the men out. And they were detained, whether or not they were part of the operation, whether or not they were legal or illegal. They could be U.S. citizens or not, irrelevant. They all got detained. That's what happens. You detain people when you serve any kind of warrant service. On Saturday, as the mass protests swept the nation, tens of thousands demonstrating in Los Angeles, the ICE agents descended at a swap meet in Santa Fe Springs in southeast Los Angeles County. Video showed dozens of heavily armed masked officers carrying out the raid, and that's apparently very, very bad. They seemed to stop anybody who looked Hispanic in any way, sparking widespread fear. Yeah. Or maybe the information that they had about who they were going after was fairly generic. And if people, generally speaking, like if you're a female with a certain skin color and you're a certain height, and we're looking for a female with a certain skin color and a certain height, and you're in that age bracket, like you might get detained and questioned. That's just what happens. So they were very upset because at least one U.S. citizen, how many non-U.S. citizens were stopped? Makes you wonder. The swap meet arrest came at the end of the week, which had ICE raids in the activity. ICE raids in the region, and the activity was targeting day laborers outside of Home Depots and car washes and warehouse workers and people outside of churches and other public spaces. And this is very, very bad. And that's why Los Angeles leaders and California leaders abroad have sued to stop the deployment of what they deem to be unconstitutional. Do you know how many people were working regular jobs and day laborers that were working in transnational organized criminal organizations? MS-13s, these TDAs, they do that. That's what they do. They show up and they get jobs that they can show up to or not show up to, depending on what they need to do. It gives them cover. It gives them a reason to have money. They get paid. Nobody knows what you pay a day laborer, so they can get money from drugs as well and from sex trafficking and the other stuff. All of this stuff is so irritating. And of course, the solution would be we need to unmask law enforcement. So here's our last little story that we're going to touch on, and I'm going to give it over to the American Radicals after this. If you guys are watching on Rumble, you guys can make sure you give us a thumbs up before you go over and see them. My friends Steve and Garrett are doing the AMRAD pod. California lawmakers have introduced legislation to ban law enforcement from wearing face coverings. I saw Scott Wiener, that like creepy pedophile looking guy who's a lawmaker out in California. And yes, I say pedophile because he's the one who said that he doesn't think that anyone should be prosecuting for paying for sex for people who are underage. That seems pretty pedophilic as far as that goes. They have dubbed the legislation the No Secret Police Act. We are in agreement. In general, I do think that cops should show their faces. The funny thing is that there's this thing called the Supremacy Clause. Just like you could outlaw someone who's not a peace officer in California from carrying a weapon, and a federal agent still can carry one, whether or not they're considered a peace officer. That's the Supremacy Clause at work. You can tell them that they have to drive with a license plate, but you cannot issue any sort of meaningful ticket to it, because if they're working in the capacity and their scope of duty as a law enforcement officer for the federal government, they can ignore all state laws. And we used to. I used to speed. I used to not carry license plates. I'd put on fake license plates. You could do all kinds of wild stuff. You could do all those things when you work in that space. So they're going to make a law about it, though. State Senator Scott Wiener and someone called Jesse Aragun. They're Democratic lawmakers from San Francisco and Oakland, respectively. Of course, they announced Monday that they'd be filing this State Bill 627 to ban local, state, and federal law enforcement from covering their faces when interacting with the public. The funny thing is what you don't hear is that they're going to ban the public from doing the same thing. I noticed a very specific pattern when I was out there at the No Kings in Austin, and I'm glad I went for this reason. One, I had no idea how many wacko people are still wearing face coverings in 2025. And two, almost every single person that wanted to engage in some sort of petty violence or tried to provoke law enforcement officers into conflict, they all wore masks. Every single one of them. They all had masks. There used to be in Washington, D.C., they used to have it in Portland and in Seattle and in Los Angeles, that there were misdemeanor offenses for wearing a mask, and wearing a mask while committing a crime was actually even worse. So there were actually ways that you could prosecute this stuff. And all of that stuff went away with COVID. It's yet another sort of legacy. In addition to debasing our institutions and telling us that we can no longer trust the medical care and all the other crazy stuff, we now also know that we've normalized covering people's faces, and that if they commit a crime and they're harder to find, even though there used to be laws about it, it's totally cool, but the cops have to unmask. I'm all about transparency in law enforcement, and I'm 100% in favor of not having cops wear these gaiters. But you better also go out there and reveal, like, all the agitators and instigators. They better not be able to wear like surgical masks or fake, or black balaclavas or whatever the heck else that they were wearing to cover themselves up. It should stop. It should stop immediately. All right. I promise this is one last little thing here. I always end up going longer than I wanted to, and I want to cover this because this is pretty crazy. This is a developing story that we're going to continue to go on, but it's been developing for like 5 years. So I do want to have somebody come on and talk about this later on. The FBI, this is according to Just the News, just gave Congress intel on the alleged Chinese plot to create fake mail-in ballots in 2020. I got a couple little things that I'm going to play for this, and I want you guys to understand that this is not a new story. Newly declassified intelligence reports. This actually looks like Dash Bongino trying to Das Pongino are trying to get some credit. And of course, they went to a friendly source like John Solomon. You guys may not know this, but when Donald Trump was giving his access to his presidential records, he named exactly 2 people in his memorandum to Congress that authorized it to the National Archives. One was Kash Patel. The other was John Solomon of Just the News. Very interesting. The 2 of them have been considered a long time. Like, they were President Trump's specific delegates to have access to his presidential records. He named them, including their phone numbers and their email addresses. That's a publicly available thing you can find out there if you wanted to know Kash's phone number. It's actually out there on the internet. It's fairly easy to find. I've had people send it to me before. It's an official memorandum from the old White House. In any case, Kash Patel on Monday turned over this information to Congress, an intelligence report raising concerns that the Chinese had mass-produced fake U.S. driver's licenses in a scheme to hijack the 2020 election with fake mail-in ballots in favor of Democrat Joe Biden. Newly declassified intelligence from August of 2020 were not corroborated or fully investigated and instead were recalled from the intelligence agencies at the time, when then Director Chris Wray testified that there were no known plots of foreign intelligence or interference ahead of the 2020 elections. I have that clip. I do want to at least give it to you in his own words. This was Chris Wray when asked under oath, are we going to see arrests? The answer is no, we're not. Just so you guys know, we're not going to see arrests, even though this is pretty clearly misleading at the very nicest, if not lies outright.
I don't think we've seen any ongoing efforts to target election infrastructure like we did in 2016. We certainly are seeing, and have never stopped seeing really since 2016, efforts to engage in malign foreign influence by the Russians. So that's the use of false personas, fake media accounts, social media stuff, the trolls, the bots, all of that stuff that's described at great length, both in the ICA and in some of the indictments that have been returned since then. The efforts to sow divisiveness and discord on both sides of an issue, and to generate controversy and to generate distrust in our democratic institutions, on our electoral process, that's very much ongoing. Other countries like China, for example, have very active malign foreign influence efforts in this country. Theirs is a little bit different than the efforts that I was just describing, but it's still very, very active and very serious. It's more geared toward, in their instance, it's more geared towards trying to shift our policy and our public opinion to be more pro-China on a variety of issues. We do know that other adversaries besides Russia are looking very closely at what the Russians have done and taking note of it and giving active consideration as to whether that's a playbook they should adopt.
Got it. Okay. But remember, social media, which has been saying this stuff for over 5 years now, are full of conspiracy theories about anything. And that's why you have to be so concerned about it. I do know that there's some uglier stuff that happened. And one of those things was we had a woman named Hillary Clinton who apparently ran for president. And she was actually actively encouraging the Chinese, along with her buddy Rachel Maddow. You wonder why the Chinese focus on certain political parties and not others. Remember, 81 million votes, Joe Biden. The Russians were the bad guys. They kept talking about it. Nothing about China. The Chinese, he's very, very non-specific about what those allegations look like. Again, we know this was out there and in the world, this story about whether or not the Russians were involved. I'm sorry, the Chinese were involved, because guys like my former producer and friend actually put it into a disclosure in 2020, letting people know that this was out there. The suspendables and the FBI whistleblowers vindicated again. None of them reinstated, but vindicated again. Here's Hillary Clinton saying that she would hope the Chinese would get involved.
You know, the only other adversary of ours who's anywhere near as good as the Russians is China. So why should Russia have all the fun? And since Russia is clearly backing Republicans, why don't we ask China to back us?
I hereby tonight ask China.
That's right. And not only that, China, if you're listening, why don't you get Trump's tax returns? I'm sure our media would richly reward you.
How unhinged was that ugly, nasty creature? This is why she wasn't elected. Even people on the left found her repulsive. She's just gross and nasty. I shudder to think about that woman being in charge. And I think that they actually expected that to be the case. That the 2016 election was supposed to go a different route. And there's some pretty good evidence that that Barack Obama was actually setting up the intelligence agencies to handle and have more power, and it would be plausibly deniable under his watch when he rewrote Executive Order 12333. I've talked about it with George Hill before, but allowing access to raw FISA by our Justice Department, specifically the FBI, getting information from the intel sphere that's raw and unprocessed and not analyzed, and directly giving it to the people that have the law enforcement capability. That's how we ended up with something really, really different. So whenever I tell people inside the Bureau, like, oh, you don't know how bad, like people go, oh, it's not that bad. I retired and it wasn't so bad when I was there. You probably weren't there when this thing was normal. And here's an MSNBC report talking about how they're really worried about, for the first time under Donald Trump, FBI. We're seeing a weaponized DOJ, and it used to be totally fair. Remember, that totally fair, totally non-weaponized FBI and DOJ were the exact same people that were using civil rights litigation to come after pro-life Catholic dads out of nowhere. And they had about a 98-2 percentage differential of who they went after with the FACE Act. Remember, they couldn't find a single person from Jane's Revenge because it was dark outside. It's really hard to find people in the dark. Apparently, they found a guy in a hyper-realistic mask in just 36 hours, but they can't find somebody who was wearing a damn hoodie in Washington, D.C., because we still don't know about the pipe bomber. In any case, this is my last little clip here, MSNBC, and then I do have something that's kind of funny. We'll go out with freedom tunes because that seems like the right way to do it.
Given this is also not a normal question, because I'm going to ask it about the Department of Justice, which heretofore, prior to this administration, it's always been held that the Department of Justice is an apolitical body. Do you see it as such now? And if you don't, the fact that these are two Democratic lawmakers that have been attacked, one killed and one right now fighting for his life in a hospital after being shot multiple times, do you have any doubt, any concern that because of political differences, biases, this will not be addressed the way it should be?
It should be apolitical, right? That's what we have seen from Republican and Democratic administrations up until this one. Right now, Donald Trump has in place people who are more loyal to him than they are to the Constitution and the rule of law. And what really, if I can rewind the tape, if I can, just 4 months ago, we saw this president pardon violent January 6 offenders, people who were convicted.
1,500 of them.
1,500. He just pardoned them. That, to me, normalized political violence. These are people, Alex, that he summoned to Washington. He told them, come to D.C. We'll be wild, he says in a tweet. And they come to Washington at his behest. They come with their zip ties. They come with their weapons. They come with their bear spray.
The FBI takes allegations of election-related violations of federal law seriously. The FBI investigates federal election crimes that generally fall into three categories: campaign finance crimes, voter ballot fraud, and civil rights violations. The FBI Washington Field Office works with our state and federal partners to engage with other law enforcement partners and provide resources about the FBI's role.
That's Tim Tebow. Guys, remember him? I'm going to post an article over on KyleSeraphin.com in the comments for this video if you guys want to go read an old New York Times article talking about how the FBI was so mean to remove this guy who had strong anti-Trump feelings, was a political actor, was alleged by whistleblowers to be working in a political hack way. And by the way, what he decided was the only thing that the FBI was going to focus on when it came to election crimes was the possibility of people being stopped from voting. Voter suppression was the only thing that mattered. And that was under the end of Donald Trump's first term and all of Joe Biden's term. They were not interested in actual election fraud. And that was fairly provably case because they didn't bring any cases against it. But they're totally fair. And of course, Donald Trump's DOJ is now weaponized. They still haven't even solved these problems. So for whatever it's worth, that's what's going on out there in the world. And like I said, I'll share that. But I had to put a little Tim Tebow in there because some of you guys don't know who that squinty-faced guy was. He seems like he's got like a real camera flush. He's got a face for not being on TV. Why they made these guys go out and do that stuff is beyond me. He was an ASAC at Washington Field while I was there and not a big fan of the types of people, that we would like. He went after Catholic dads and so on inside of the FBI. Imagine that. If they'll go after people inside the Bureau, they'll definitely come after you. All right, that's the end of the show today. Rumble.com/Kyle Seraphin. Give us a like. Watching over on YouTube, give us a like over there. It's youtube.com/@Kyle Seraphin. Really appreciate all of you guys joining and being part of the crew. if you guys want to watch it over on Locals. Again, I am going to add a couple of articles that were covered here very briefly, and you might want to read them for yourself, including some historical stuff. It's at Locals. That's KyleSeraphin.com. It's free to read over there. Just a place where I store some of the things if you guys want some of the backstory on what we did. And we'll also have the Blaze article there. And lastly, Spotify, KyleSeraphinShow.com. You guys might start seeing on the video side of Spotify, you might start seeing some pre-roll or some mid-roll ads. Let me know if they're really distracting. They asked me if I would approve it. The answer is yes for now, but if they start being like really kind of taken away from the program, then I'll make sure we discontinue it. Kind of just seeing if it helps for monetization over there. So full disclosure, that's what's happening. All right, let's get something funny to laugh about. The world is silly, and this is even sillier. This is why we don't trust the mainstream media, because they believe in that sort of mostly peaceful, right? There's they debase their own credibility, including on stuff like COVID, but probably from the George Floyd block parties. Here's our friend Seamus with the Freedom Tunes. This is a little clever thing to laugh about.
Tensions rise as Donald Trump sends the military in to commit an act of genocide against a belated but mostly peaceful Cinco de Mayo celebration. We go live now to our reporter on the ground. I'm here in LA, where there's a mostly peaceful demonstration of people gathering to celebrate the rich cultural heritage of low-cost labor. We haven't seen anything this docile since the Floyd family block parties of 2020. Is there any chance there will be an escalation of peace? In fact, as you can see behind me, it appears the situation has just escalated from mostly peaceful to tremendously tranquil. Wow, is there any risk of this becoming gargantuanly gentle? In fact, we've skipped right past that, as the LAPD are now reclassifying the demonstration as staggeringly serene. Wow, truly a colossally calm gathering here. It looks as if things have taken a turn towards superlatively harmonious, overwhelmingly placid, outrageously amicable. Our on-the-ground reporter seems to have lost connection with the mortal world. No worries, our in-house necromancer is here to get us back up and running. Have you found him yet?
I'm on it.
We go dead to our reporter underground. That was Chaz resting mostly in peace.
Go check out Freedom Tunes if you guys don't have them already bookmarked or followed. Good stuff, and probably the right amount of humor for what we have. I hadn't seen a necromancer on television before, but that's where it is. All right, don't do any of that nonsense. Thanks for joining us in the chat. God bless all of you. Look forward to seeing you again tomorrow, Wednesday. I just found out that 3 of my 4 children were born on Wednesdays, so Wednesdays are now my new favorite days. We'll see you guys again for the Kyle Seraphin Show at 0930 Eastern Time, 8:30 Texas, America. Have a good one for the rest of the day.
Thanks for listening to the Kyle Seraphin Show, streamed live weekdays on rumble.com/Kyle Seraphin. Follow Kyle on Twitter, Truth Social, and Instagram at Kyle Seraphin.